So in this section, we're going to try and talk about how Silla is going to end up unifying Korea. And I should say unifying because there's arguments about whether this was a unity. But you'll recall we had talked about how there's kind of three Korea kingdoms, but the Koreans also have this identity of being connected to a state. So where do we get to the point where we have just one state for the Korean people? Now, there were three Korean kingdoms, right? Koguryo, which we talked about later, Baekje, which I apologize we won't talk about much, and Silla, which we're going to be talking a lot about here. Silla was the furthest away from China, right? Koguryo is right next to China. Baekje was closer to China. Silla used to only be like right down here in this area. So Silla was the last to have contact with the Chinese, and so thus developed last, right? So that's why I call it a latecomer. Right, it starts to develop into a full-fledged kingdom after Koguryo, and I believe also after Baekje. So the characteristics of this kingdom, that's going to be the one that unifies Korea. It's located in the southeast, right? It's behind other states in borrowing from China, so it starts late, right? It's further away from China, it doesn't have easy access, so it doesn't get access to advanced Chinese civilization like writing and ideas of government. So it develops later, but it does have one big advantage. It's much harder for China to get to it, right? It's much harder for China to threaten it militarily, unlike Koguryo, which China can just attack very easily. One thing that's really interesting about the Silla is the social system, because it has several aspects that are going to continue into even 19th century Korea, into the modern era. They had, of course, commoners, just people, they had a status system with commoners in it. They also had slaves, fairly large number of slaves. Korea can be in many ways classified as a slave society. There are that many slaves. One thing I should point out is that Koreans typically enslaved other Koreans. So it was kind of same ethnic group slavery. They also had an aristocracy, and they had what was called a bone rank system, where they had different ranks of aristocrats. It was very clear what rank these different aristocrats were. Korea was and is a very hierarchical culture. And you can see it even in its beginnings, where it has this very complex social system, like I say, with slaves on the bottom, commoners, and aristocrats, and all sorts of different ranks of aristocrats. These aristocrats were considered to have a special duty to the state, and aristocratic men form something called the hwarang, which can be translated in many different ways, all of which sound really awkward in English. One of my favorites, I think, is the flower boy corps. But basically, it was this idea of these young men who were kind of like knights who would fight for the good of the government, fight for the good of their state. Right? So you had this idea that to be an aristocrat means that you serve the government. Right? There's a close relationship between being an aristocrat and being a member of the state, or being Korean. But in particular, this is understood in terms of military service. But in Korea, what will develop is an idea that if you're in the upper class, if you're an aristocrat, you perform service for the government. Here with the hwarang, it's military service. And the hwarang are one reason, this kind of special military corps is one reason why they got so powerful. And in addition, one thing I think is fascinating is that the Silla had sumptuary laws. Sumptuary laws are laws about who can wear what type of clothing, how big a person's house can have, all dependent on their social status. So the idea is that you can't just buy something because you can afford it. You can't just wear certain clothes because you can afford it. Those are only reserved for special people of a certain rank. And the idea is to try and maintain that hierarchy. Now, one thing that's really fascinating to talk about, again, because we're trying to understand the ancient roots of modern Korea, one person that's fascinating to talk about is Queen Seondeok, right? Queen Seondeok, and you can see here, this is a modern drama about her. There's been multiple dramas about her. But women in traditional Korea, ancient Korea, actually had a comparatively high position. They could become queens. And this is important to note because once Korea became really Confucian, women could not become monarchs. They couldn't actually rule. Seondeok was a queen who ruled. I want to stress, she wasn't queen because she was married to a king. She was a queen who actually ruled. And as queen, she encouraged science and learning. She's famous for building like an astronomical observatory to help, and rain gauges and things like that to help Koreans develop a correct calendar so people would know when's the right time to plant food and things like that. She also encouraged Buddhism. for a variety of reasons. It was to develop Silla legitimacy. The idea was to bring in this religion, and we'll talk more about Buddhism later, but bring in a powerful, well-advanced religion with its own scriptures, with very complex rituals that really impressed people. And then by supporting that, it made the government look good, right? We found this really cool religion. It's really deep. It's really complex. It has all these powerful rituals and prayers, and we, the government, support it. So it supports us, and aren't we awesome for supporting it? We'll talk more about that later. But Queen Seondeok was a supporter of this powerful religion. And as such, it allowed her at times to claim to be a prophet. She was believed, because of her connections to Buddhism and her own spiritual power, that she was able to see the future. And she actually claimed to be a living Buddha. And traditionally in Asia, women monarchs liked Buddhism because in Buddhism you could be reborn in many different lives. So you could be like a man now, but a woman in a previous life. You could be a woman now, but a man in a previous life. So it kind of blurred gender boundaries. So if you're a Buddhist, having a Korean or having a queen isn't that big of a deal. In fact, it was believed that Buddha himself had lived as a woman in certain times of his life. It's not a big deal. So of course, a woman would adopt Buddhism, a queen, as a kind of ruling idea. Like I said, it has comparative gender ideology, right? Comparative gender equality there. Now, Queen Seondeok was served in part by a very good general named Kim Yushin. He's going to be key in unifying Korea. And he's actually, I think he's on the 1,001 note, which is like 80 cents. But he will form an alliance with Tong China, right? So you'll have this Korean state of Silla working with China. Tong is the name of the dynasty, so it's the Tong dynasty of China. Together, they will destroy Baekje, the kingdom I don't talk much about, Baekje, in 660, and Goguryeo in 668. Right, so together they will destroy those two kingdoms, and Silla will expand into their territory. And then in the 670s, there will be a series of war between Silla and Tong, and Silla will actually survive this war against China and make peace. And so in the old history of Korea, Silla is seen as the hero, especially in southern Korea, because it unifies Korea, at least the southern part. So many people say with this victory of Silla against Baekje and Goguryeo and its ability to fight the Tong to a standstill, Silla has unified Korea. It's the hero, right? Because remember, Korean identity is closely connected in this time period of having one, living in a monarchy, living in a kingdom. But we had several kingdoms. Now we just got one Korean kingdom. So it must have unified Korea. That's the old logic. For some Koreans today, Silla is the villain because it collaborated with foreigners to fight against other Koreans. Right? Remember, Silla is able to destroy these other two Korean kingdoms and absorb some of their territory because they allied with the Chinese. And especially if you're from North Korea, you don't like Silla because they helped destroy Goguryeo, and Silla unification did not include all of North Korea. So for some Koreans, today, Kim Yushin and Silla are heroes. For others, not so much. But like I said, this is kind of an anachronistic projection of nationalistic ideas of Korean history back. I don't know how unified these people felt, right? How unified did these people of Silla and Baekje and Goguryeo feel, right? Did they think of themselves as Korean? It's hard to tell because no one asked them these questions, right? So it's kind of weird to go back and ask these questions. Is this unified Korea? As a historian, I would say we see the continued development of this group of people who will increasingly come to identify as Korean, right? We see them building their identity. Now, we need to know also the importance of unification. You can see kind of my point here that this is why North Koreans don't much like Silla, because they didn't unify the North too. They did not get a hold of Pyongyang. Though I should point out that there's another Korean kingdom called Balhae, which I think China also claims. This ancient East Asian history gets complex. So it's tricky because on one side you can be critical of Silla because they only united 2/3 of Korea. Right? They only successfully unite 2/3 of Korea. They don't get Pyongyang, the current day capital of North Korea. But in their defense, they did form a strong state independent of China. Right? They do form a strong state independent of China. Korea could have been conquered by China, and the Koreans could have all become Chinese. That didn't happen. They form a strong state independent of China that can maintain its own security and identity. And the people in the state, at least the elites, live in that state for hundreds of years, serve it, and strongly identify with it. Right? For Koreans in this time period, identity is closely connected to the state, and for the elites especially, service to the state. And living in the same government for hundreds of years, and Silla does last several hundred years, people develop an identity to it. So what I would argue what we have here is we have the developing idea of a Korea that should be unified and independent. There's this idea, we're Korean, that's developing. What does being Korean mean? It means that we have our own culture, but we also have our own state that we govern. Right? And this is key to the development of a Korean identity, that there is this independent state that is built both on borrowing from advanced civilizations like China, but also maintains its own indigenous traditions. And these people will increasingly think of themselves as something different from the people surrounding them, and look at each other, look at these other people in the same state and say, we're the same. Right? Increasingly, they're going to see themselves, even though they don't have a word for it, as Korean. So I say, even though we can criticize Silla, or Koreans sometimes criticize it because it doesn't unify all of Korea, it is an important step to the development of a modern Korean identity.